what it was that we wanted. We wanted a conference that was on Africa. And every single paper that we accepted for this conference was on Africa. So there were people who were not that happy about that curatorial choice. But I think that this was an important thing that we managed to do. So we wanted it to be on Africa and specifically on law and society scholarship from Africa, not on doctrinal scholarship. We wanted it to be from Africa. We wanted predominantly, overwhelmingly, in fact entirely, if that was possible, to have African scholars showcasing the work that they were doing in the law and society field on Africa. And we wanted the conference to be in Africa. And I think that what we've seen over the last 3 days is that vision really coming together in a spectacular way. It has been a wonderful, wonderful couple of days, and I would like you to just take a moment to celebrate yourselves, to celebrate the fabulous scholarship. So the key question for us then becomes, how do we take this forward? You know? Do we do this again? When do we do this again? How do we do this again? Tomorrow. I know the panels that I've been in, there's been so much synergy around the work that is being done across the continent. And we want to use this last session to really just think forward. So we have 3 panelists, interlocutors, up front, but this is really an opportunity for all of us to think together about how we move forward with this. And the selection of people up front is deliberate. In Kelly Moult and Amar Shalakani, you have representatives of the 2 institutionalized university-based centers for the study of law and society on the continent. So we want to put them on the spot. We want to ask them, what are you guys at your centers going to do to take this forward? And Heinz Klug is not only a stalwart of law and society scholarship in South Africa, but internationally. So Heinz, to some extent, is speaking to those international networks, to the Law and Society Association, to the opportunities that we have, not only to move this forward on the continent, but to make much more visible the work on Africa that has been done, just the excellent work that has been showcased over the last 3 days. So I'm going to ask them, and I'm going to ask you, to think about this in terms of, number 1, visibilizing the work that is being done by Africans on Africa. Number 2, to think about how we take forward this work in our teaching, and then how we take it forward in our research. And I am going to hand over then to which one of you? First, to Amar. All right, Amar, you're on.
So thank you so much for having me here again. And it's an amazing conference, and I've definitely learned a lot. And I'll start by saying that the usual joke in Egypt is that the hardware is in Africa. Egypt is in Africa as a hardware. However, the software is all over the place. So a bit of Islamic law, a bit of Arab law, a bit of a connection with the Eastern Mediterranean base, and that mix of the hardware is in Africa, but the software seems to be everywhere, has usually resulted in a much diminished interest in sub-Saharan African scholarship, in Arab legal scholarship until today, and that's definitely one thing that I would like to see more of, having realized over the last couple of days that there is an amazing amount of really, really great scholarship, and that one has learned a lot about. One of the first things that comes to mind is from the last couple of panels, and particularly the evening panel yesterday, is this shared sense from Cape to Cairo of a loss of faith in the emancipatory potentials of law, and yet a desire to figure out how is it that we can reclaim that energy back. So that's one thing that I would love to capitalize and use in class. And there are several examples that I've been jotting down since we started, but it all has to do with almost similar tactics used by governments across the continent in what can be called sort of a comparative law of worst practices. That's, I don't know how is it that they've moved around the continent and just reproduced exactly the same moves, but they're very similar. That's it.
So I suppose I would pick up kind of from there about these shared conversations. I think we've had many moments in many of the panels where we've kind of thought about or recognized similarities across contexts, similar questions. Dave, Trebek and I were talking just now about, or with Penny Andrews, about protest in the 60s and 70s and how in some ways those scripts, which David was talking about had happened in his context then, could have as easily have been the story of UCT Law Faculty 2016. So this idea that there are threads that run through the continent, through regions, through time. And so I think the challenge for us as scholars here, knowing that the literature, the published literature, is but a tiny, tiny piece of what is out there. Who reads the published literature is even a smaller, smaller, tiny piece. Is to how we create a new space for ourselves to have those conversations about the common threads of experience, of theory, of bringing practice and the classroom closer together, of invigorating conversations about law and lawyering, about society and how it fits within that in a way that is meaningful for developing those conversations.
Can I just add two small things as proposals? One thing is the need for a bibliography of law and society in Africa, so a mapping out of what the scholarship that's out there is. That would be helpful, I think, for all of our work. And the second is, having the next event in Cairo. So it seems like the logical thing. So from Cape to Cairo, maybe in 2 years' time rather than, immediately in 5 minutes. Sorry.
Well, I must say that this has been an absolutely extraordinary few days. And I want to thank all of you for how much I've learned in these last few days from you, from the papers. I've just been stunned. So I think what's just been mentioned was one of the first points I wanted to put on the table. We need a bibliography. Dave Trebek and working with a student had started to draw stuff together. I think we need to formally pull that together as part of this network. But part of that also ties into the network. Every one of you now are part of this network. I've asked and they promised to send out just a straight list of names and email addresses. And it takes us work, because of course when we get home and to the busy things we do, it's very hard to respond to the emails that are coming from a network. There's another part of that network, and that is the Law and Society Association has a CRN, a research network that is about Africa. And we want to take the opportunity to put all these names into that network, so that when we send out a call for papers for a Law and Society meeting anywhere, all of you get that and pass it on to your colleagues. Anybody who's interested in law, what law does, not just what law says, that's the people we want. Those are the colleagues you want to recruit and say, look, there's something interesting happening. I went to Cape Town and it actually was interesting and fun, right? And so let's look at the next opportunity to do that. But I think working on together, an annotated biography is going to leave people out unless you send the material in, just the citation and the name and where it is, so that it can be listed. And we can hopefully build that just collectively with the network as a start. So those are just two very simple ideas. It took 2 years of hard work by the centers and by recruiting the people who helped put some seed money down and then getting the organization, the International LSA, to buy into this, to make this happen. So, you say 2 years, let's make it happen in 2 years, but we've got to start now probably, right? So It takes time to get meetings like this together. But smaller workshops, if you're interested in law and society in your institutions, try and put a workshop together. Invite a few other people from nearby countries in Africa or from across the continent, right? We're going to have to build this network ourselves, every one of us. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. Right? If we wait for the call from Cape Town again, we'll wait another 20 years. We're going to keep going. Right? Yeah, you see. So that's my provocation. And let's hear from you now, whether you're on board, what you're interested in, what proposals you might have that we haven't even thought about. Thank you.
It occurs to me that a resource that we have is research assistants that get paid for by our institutions, and oftentimes we don't have enough work, meaningful work, for those research assistants to do. So it just occurs to me again that one small thing that I could contribute is in this effort to assemble a biography, a bibliography, for example, that I could probably get some good labor, and I assume that's true of others who have come from the United States and wealthier countries. That's it.
UCT, even though you say 20 years, you know that the resources, our resources that we have, we'd love to be able to work with you to make the next one possible. So just the obvious, maybe a small committee from this should be formed immediately that can then start working towards the program that will happen in 2 years.
Is that a call for volunteers?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
If I had one small critique of the conference, it's very explicitly wanted to be in and of Africa, but it is of course here in South Africa. And Ruth reminded us yesterday that South Africa is not Africa. And so I think this is a big challenge for us to ensure that the next time we do this, it is more of Africa.
I think the bibliography is a terrific idea, but it would be great if we could also have some place where people could put what they're working on and what they're interested in working on. Because some of us, like me, who have a project that I really am looking to work with people here, would be really interesting to know who's interested in lawyers, who's interested in the relationship between kind of the development of a corporate sector and other parts of the legal profession or other parts of the economy. So, and a bibliography is static, so I don't know whether we could have a website where people could post things. So I'm likely to be coming back to the continent several times over the next few years as we try to put the project together. I've already done some things in Nigeria, some things in Kenya. I'd like to do things in other parts, so it's kind of a double-edged sword. One is I'd love it if I'm going to be someplace to be able to post it somewhere where if people were interested in coming and interacting, we hold public events. But also I'd be happy if I'm in a city or a country to do a small workshop or a talk at a university or something like that. And then the second thing is if people are looking for resources. So in other words, if somebody is studying something about the legal profession and they want to post a question about, well, you know, what's it like in the US or in France or in the UK or something that we might know something about, that we could be a resource here. I think the most exciting thing, the projects that you all are doing, I agree with Heinz totally, are completely thrilling just to have in a room like this where a lot of people don't frankly know the caliber and the quality of the work that's being done here, the incredible graduate students who are coming through the pipeline, the mentorship that they're getting from more senior lawyers. I think that's really, really important. And if, you know, those of us who are working in the area leave anything, you know, I hope we publish books, I hope we have conferences, but the most important thing we want to do is help with the development of people, of the new generation of scholars who are going to take this kind of commitment to law and society work to the next level in a way that'll not just influence Africa, but will influence back in the global north and around South-South and all the other dimensions. So the last piece I put in is that it's not, Africa of course has to be the focus, but I think the South-South dimension, the relationships between Africa and Latin America, Africa and Asia, are going to be ones that are increasingly important. You already see the importance of China and Africa, Brazil and Portuguese-speaking Africa, you know, India, the Indian diaspora is huge here. And if we could begin to create networks around those sorts of issues that cut across a kind of South-South dimension, I think that would be terrific. And a small plug for anybody who can get to Law and Society, which is going to be in Mexico City, which I think is a very important place to begin that kind of dialogue.
I mean, for me, most of the sessions I attended has been about law, as in like law school, the academia, the law as you would find it in the courtroom, with and all of that, the adjudication. But then I think we also need to think about law as in lawmaking with the parliamentary process, because the societies we work in and with this, where this law applies, are changing so much, especially with some parliaments not being there in the issue of lawmakers and parliament being suspended. It's something to think about. But also, even at an international level, in terms of law and these treaties, I mean, when we had a conversation about constitutionalism, when you look at also the International Criminal Court, this issue about authority and legitimacy, to say there may be legitimacy but not authority. And insofar as some of the interactions and plays are interstate, I think it would be good going forward to also bring in more of the voices that are at play at that level. Thank you.
The more I think about it, a database would be great. Do you know, with email groups, there's so many floods of emails coming in that it's easy to ignore them. With a database, it's convenient because you can choose when you go to it. And I especially like the fact about the South and South connection, because often, perhaps by chance or because of the way things are structured globally, we don't get much from Latin America, we don't get much from Asia. I mean, hearing Tanya Hernandez speaking yesterday about Latin America, we were sitting here thinking, that's just like us. But we don't know this. A database would not only provide connections, but it would also mean that people can post the published articles on it. So if we have thematic areas, you know, if you're looking under gender, law, and society, you can go to the database and you can find published material. It can also be a place where there can be announcements for, let's say, for a call, for a peer-reviewed journal, or for a book. So, I mean, we can start from the people in this room, we can start to create a rich resource that's not only beneficial for us, but that has ripple effects without having people feel like they're being flooded with too much information.
It's some hesitance that I take the floor. I'm from the Netherlands, and it all started here with Roman Dutch law, and I want to make an advert for a project that I'm embarking on. But it is a kind of transformative project, I hope. I think it's very important that we have for our students, for the LLB, we have a good introduction to social legal studies. And together with Chepo from University of Pretoria, we started a project, but just as David Wilkins, we all can learn from the Americans. You need supporters from all countries. So if some of you is interested to participate in this project, how can we interest our students, to begin in South Africa, but also for the rest of the continent, in the sociology of law, because that is the discipline that relates the society we live in with the law, and there's a world to be won, and I hope you give the Dutch a second chance.
I actually disagree a bit with my sister over there regarding emails. I think by and large emails are very effective, particularly if there's something you're looking out in your inbox. In my case, I read all my emails, so if I don't respond, it's just that I don't find it relevant. So I think the bigger point is to try to use all forms of contact that can be personalized, whether it's emails or social media and all that. I'm a bit concerned, quite frankly, that whenever I attend many conferences, it's almost obvious if you dig a little bit deeper to notice a pattern of networks of students or researchers who are in some school together. And I'm not accusing UCT, I've been here like 3 times, so I have great friends here. But then you first realize that there's a risk that we are alienating other countries. So, for example, it's clear that we only have Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and a bit of SADC. Of course, and African diaspora. And when we were together with Professor Klug in the King's College the other day, you almost certainly found Kenya, Ghana, and a group of Harvard alumni. So, so I don't know how we can try to work hard to reach to quote-unquote fringe African jurisdictions, so that we do not eventually nib in the bud the very good idea of trying to build capacity in the continent. Finally, very finally, so I came here because I met Professor Klug in London. But from that event, I also met a colleague from Singapore National University. So we are trying to put up a workshop in Nairobi somewhere next year that I hope to share with you, and that seems to have received some little funding, looking at emergence of courts in Asia, Kenya, Africa, and Latin America. So my experience that when you talk to people during drinking sessions and these things, you get to learn more. Thank you.
So I'm really interested in thinking about ways in which we can use Western resources to support African agendas. And I think one of the tangible ways we can do that is, a resource we have is human rights clinics all over America. And they are always looking for projects and work to do. And so if anyone here has a project somehow related to human rights, please come and see me, and I'd love to try and connect you with a clinic in the US who can help you do the research or whatever for the project that is initiated by you. I and along with a lot of other American law professors here, have that connecting resource to connect you to the clinical resources. So I think we need to think systematically about how to do that, again, with the larger purpose of making sure African agendas are prioritized.
So, Bernadette, I think that's a great idea, but I also have a hesitation about it, in that I think that we should be building our own African human rights law clinics, and not having people from somewhere else helping us out. I kind of feel an anxiety sometimes, even when we talk about collaborations. We were approached some time ago to do a project as CLS with some other scholars from the North about lawyers and how they develop, and how they have a kind of social justice initiative when they come in and what happens to it out of there. But it very quickly became quite apparent to many of us that it's not an equal partnership, right? That we're going to be the on-the-ground fieldwork, implementing, managing partner, but that the big name attached to the project is the person that's going to shape what comes out and is going to take first bite at the data or whatever else, right? So I have a real kind of uncomfortable relationship with both leveraging those partnerships in a way that, to have those resources at your disposal when you don't have others is really a wonderful opportunity. But at the same time, thinking about what are the costs associated with those things. If we're farming our work out to students sitting in the US somewhere, what is the poverty to our own students, to our own colleagues, our own faculty members? And I think that's a real tension for some of us that I think has to be part of this conversation. And then my other point I wanted to make was that Dee doesn't know yet, but we're going to ask her, because she's on the program committee for Mexico, to find us a space where those of us who have been here and will be in Mexico again can come together perhaps for a conversation to continue what we've started talking about here. So those of you who are going to be there, bookmark, and I'll use my influence.
Thank you for doing this. When I was coming, one of my major goals was to actually connect with people on the continent. Because I mean, I left Liberia almost 24 years ago, and I don't really have that kind of network and connection on the continent with a lot of wonderful people, and you have left me with an indelible, real life experience that I am not even able to express how much my appreciation is. So I just really wanted to say thank you, and please take the conference to West Africa in Liberia. We'll be happy to host you.
I think there is tremendous talent on the African continent, and also diversity in this scholarship. So what I would really hope would happen from this would be a way of consolidating the interventions that develop this capacity that we have seen at this conference, and particularly also recognizing the Black African scholarly talent.
I'd also like to just add, in terms of all the wonderful suggestions that have been made here in terms of the biography and data, etc., that we also throw into that pot some form of advocacy. Because I think what's important in platforms like this, where we have the skills, the experience, the expertise of people that are so good in what they do, that we need to harness those skills and actually make change in the field that we are so passionate about. So that's what I'd like to see also happening. Thank you.
It might be worth considering also for those who are attached to the LSA at the sort of bigger levels to potentially push to advocate that a future LSA meeting be held either in Cape Town or in Joburg, partially because there's the tradition of moving LSA around to different areas, and while I'm sure that the powers that be in LSA will whinge about distance, that there are good reasons, there are good ways to sort of argue back that I'd be happy to talk about. And secondly, I think it'd be useful for people who might not have exposure to the kind of both legal work that's happening in places like South Africa and the African continent more broadly, and the kind of intellectual work that's taking place here to be exposed to it. It'd be an extraordinarily good thing, I think, for the law and society movement as a whole to bring people who might not otherwise be exposed here. So it might, and then lastly, frankly, to bring the monetary resources that come with hosting a big conference to bring something back to the African continent. So it might be worth sort of thinking about in 5 or 6 years trying to make a bid for hosting the conference as a whole. Thank you.
There must be meetings, and this meeting is going to be remembered historically. But you don't always have to go to all the trouble and fundraising and logistics of bringing people together, especially once they've been together. So think more use of virtual tools, because the resources available fall far below what really the potential we have here for networking, for exchange of ideas, for joint projects. I'm going to comment on that last point. Forget it. Just forget it. Unless you can guarantee that 2,000 people will show up, they won't do it because of the way the meetings finance the organization. And this is why we pushed so much for this meeting, because we knew that you cannot bring the annual meetings to places where you cannot at least get 1,000 Americans to show up. If you can't get 1,000 Americans to show up, then the finances of the meeting will fail. And it's terrible truth, but I've spent 20 years working with that truth to try to find ways. And the CRNs, which I was helpful in getting started, are one way. Every 5 years, the fellowships to bring people from developing countries to the meeting, but you can't move the meeting. And the only reason that Mexico is working is because it's in North America and the airfares from the United States are the same as going to some other place in the United States. Otherwise, it would not happen. So it's a great idea, but I think we need to work. I have an idea that wouldn't cost almost anything. All right. How about the course? How about creating a course on the introduction to law and society in Africa, which would be put together by a group of people in various universities who would agree to get that course listed and then have it taught by that group of people using Skype. So you'd have Amr talk about something in Cairo, and then you'd have, luckily one thing about Africa is an advantage is you don't have too many time zones, right? You have too many, you have some, but you have as many. And then, you know, so maybe 3 or 4 schools would agree to list this, and then the person in that school would be listed as the professor. But the classes would be taught by the group. So each week you could have a different lecture. It would cost nothing, almost. And now that Skype is really working well, it's practically free. And I think this kind of idea, using websites which have been suggested, post all the papers, or at least the selections of papers, on your website, and then mirror it on the Law and Society website. They will do that for you. But I think that you've got to think virtually, because the work that it takes and the money and the resources to create a meeting like this, which is essential to get things started, is not easy to replicate.
I think there are funders that are supportive of a vision of African scholars connecting much more strongly, much more pervasively across the continent than we've been doing. And I think that insofar as that commitment is there right now, we need to grab it and we need to run with it. I also want to recognize Professor Chuma Himonga as somebody who has been doing what Dave is talking about, who is a pioneering Law and Society scholar on the continent, but who has also, over 2 decades, Chuma, done exactly this, of co-branding, teaching across African institutions, teaching on women and law in Africa. So we at the University of Cape Town have a master's course on law and society in Africa. It forms part of a program on law and society in Africa, in which there's methods teaching and there's theory teaching, and that's something that we would really like to bring more people into, and to think about how we take the kind of work that Chuma has been doing forward to make this a course that, again, is in, on, and from Africa. 2 other points that have been raised. The one is, what are we going to do with the papers? And thanks to Diane's gentle but relentless cajoling, I think that everybody has papers. I think this is part of actually why we ended up with such phenomenal presentations, was the level of preparation that Diane forced us all into. So, there needs to be a discussion about whether there's something that we can do with it. But I'm also very much aware, having surveyed all of the Law and Society journals and reviews over the last 50 years, since 1960, right? And maybe 2 in 100 papers comes out of Africa. And those papers that tend to be published in those journals tend to be kind of fetishist papers, right? They're about sex and violence and, a little bit about South Africa's transition, kind of trended at some point. So I'm very keen that we also think about how we get the papers that were presented here into that kind of scholarship that starts representing a different picture about law and society in Africa, that, there's a little bit of life beyond sex, violence, rock and roll. All right, over to you. Closing thoughts?
I think I've said I've said a lot already, but I think that just the energy, the expertise, the smartness that's in this room. I don't know if any of you have actually had a look at your little these notebooks. It says at the bottom, think left and think right, think low and think high, or the things you can think if only you try. I just was struck by how absolutely apt that is for this conference. We've seen people just extending scholarship, just pushing against it, exploding it, and I think in a really real way. So I think that just for me is the most amazing take-home, energizing take-home that will just hopefully take us through the contestations of where the next Law and Society in Africa conference is going to be.
So I'd echo exactly the same feelings, and would point at two things. One is the archival work that definitely should be shared across, and second is the clinical and advocacy work that is such an amazing treasure trove of knowledge and of energy. And I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, I think we need to take this energy forward. And so all I remind you to do is to recruit. You want to tell other colleagues that in fact this was useful. And if they want to be part of it, they need to step up and be part of it. But it's on us who are here today to take that forward. Because we had the experience, we learned a great deal from each other. Let's bring other people into the show.